Coin traders, what is going on? Thanks for joining me for the show. Looking at Solana SOL on that ticker. And so after a big announcement for a partnership with Visa, not necessarily kind of the follow through and continuation that we're expecting, but overall still holding a pretty nice bottom on top of the $19 level. And right now we are sitting right on top of that $20 psychological level. So we're going to be analyzing some of these price levels in the show today. So if that sounds good and you are all about this type of show, you know what to do. Hit that thumbs up, like, and subscribe button if you have not done so just yet. And so do want to start off actually dropping into the weekly chart here, talk about all things that we're seeing right now for Solana on this longer term weekly chart, because a lot of very relevant zones going on here that are actually pretty linear. So do want to start off, we're looking at a big, nice horizontal line of support for close on this weekly chart. So looking at 1952, we're just going to go ahead and effectively call that the 1950 level. So if we actually go ahead and zoom in on the current candles, you can see looking at a very nice defense and support from the bulls so far anyway of this 1952 level. Looking left, very nice weekly close of support, and then plenty of lower shadows on these other previous wicks that do drop down. So looking at a very nice level of closing support for this weekly, and we do have 2 days and 20 hours left before we actually do see a close. Now, what is significant about this weekly chart is that if we actually look at volume on the upside, big nice move, not necessarily that much increasing volume, but we do have week over week increasing bullish volume nonetheless, followed by a short amount of decreasing bearish volume on the pullback, small volume on this little bounce, which did kick off the 12 and 26 period exponential moving averages for this weekly, before finally seeing another 3 weeks of downside with extremely minimal selling pressure. So now if we actually assume that we are going to be holding and maintaining support at 1950, up overhead is going to be a pretty big level of closing resistance for this weekly, coming in right below the $22 line at 21.92. So as you can see, big point of closing resistance that also aligns with these 12 and 26 periods, which if we do talk about, like we said, on this bounce, very nice period of support. So realistically, that would flip into a period of resistance, especially since this was a period of resistance previously, and looking left, resistance and resistance as well again. Now, if we actually want to talk about supports for actual price levels and not just levels of closing support, then there's very few key ones that we are going to be looking at. Specifically, we're going to be looking at 1904, just above the $19 level, and then 1875. So as we can see, current price levels defending off that support, and then looking left, the lower 1875, we found 2 weeks bouncing off of that before obviously the huge candle flush here on the beginning of June sell-off. But current prices are still maintaining way higher highs on top of that level. So if we look at the low, which did come in at 1321, and so if we actually draw a price level on that mark, then the next thing that I want to do is look at a Fibonacci retracement from that current price level of support up to the high, which we were looking at coming in over the 32, or pretty much just shy of 3250. And so this retracement that we're actually looking at from that high does dip below the 61.8. So we are still finding defense between the 61.8 and the 78.6. 78.6 level right now is going to be at 1731. So a plenty big buffer right now, especially since we have a lot of very strong support levels coming in on this overall pullback. But the reason that I do want to bring this up is that typically when we see pullbacks this substantial, that's not necessarily a very good sign of just an immediate rally and breaking this to see a new higher high. So typically when we do see pullbacks between the 61.8 and 78.6, that's a little bit more assurance that most likely we're going to see a lower high come in, and then the bulls, very, very good case in that instance, is going to be a little bit more of a tightening range, which is good for confirming some longer term supports, which does lead to a little bit longer upside growth. So that is what we want to see. Otherwise, we would be rallying down to actually test some of these lower lows and hold that defense. But like we said, next shortest upside resistance target based on this weekly is going to be at 21.92. So we are going to need to smash these exponential moving averages as well as this big prior price point of closing resistance. Now, one of the things that I do want to talk about with regard to this weekly chart is the exponential moving averages, because like we look at on a lot of charts, these actually do start pretty far apart, and you can see the gap, for example, in this zone, how far apart the 50 is from the 26 and also the 12 period exponential moving average. So we know that at some point we do have to see these get close together, which is pretty much what we're starting to see right now. And although if we zoom in, it doesn't look that close, when we actually zoom out and look at the bigger picture and what these actually did look like before, especially when we did see that we were getting rejected from the 12-period exponential moving average, followed by the 26, the fact that we actually broke that is still a good sign, especially since we have now been setting higher lows on all of these pullbacks. In addition to that, what's really key and critical right now is just how tight these exponential moving averages are getting together. And like we already looked at, we almost saw a very nice touch and cross of the 12 and 26 period exponential moving average. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because we are looking at a little bit of that pullback, but that does mean that these levels are starting to get closer and closer together, which typically does mean a very nice sign of future opportunity for a little bit more of that volatility. And usually that does shape up, especially in this type of setup where we are setting higher lows in this very nice stair-steppy pattern. It is starting to increase the likelihood that the bottom has already been in, and that the potential upside and these rolling over in a bearish formation, a bullish formation, are actually going to start to increase here, because as we do start to see these roll over and start to get tighter and tighter and tighter, especially in this type of instance where typically what we see is huge gaps between the 12 and the 26, they get really tight and then eventually they cross. And then what happens next is that the 50 rolls up behind that as well, and then ultimately we do get that bullish cross on the 50. So obviously nothing is guaranteed, because we could still see a complete rejection. Then obviously that would open up these exponential moving averages once again. But typically, especially when we are finding longer term weekly lows, higher lows anyway, especially for about 9 months here, and on top of that, we are starting to see the exponential moving averages get closer. That's where we really look to some of the shorter term supports and start to make a little bit more of that speculation that these are going to get closer and closer together and eventually flip in that bullish manner, which would be a result of the price actually seeing a lot more upside. Now, if we do turn on the Bollinger Bands, you can see this in a little bit more of a technical indicator illustrated pattern. And so especially after having this very big gap on the upper and lower limit for these Bollinger Bands, you can see right now just how tight these are getting together. So movement is definitely going to be on the horizon here. Okay, so now I want to flip into the daily chart, talk about a little bit more of the short-term action, because like we said, after a pullback and now, especially after the big Visa announcement, not necessarily in the best bullish setup and formation right here, but a few big patterns to be looking at. And one of the big ones that I do want to point out is just how we are forming if we take from the high over here down to the other price points that we rejected off of, looking at several tests of this downtrend resistance line. So on the current, we're very close to seeing a big break of that. And then if we actually draw a downtrend support line, we can see that we are starting to form a little bit more of a longer term falling wedge, with the apex coming in somewhere around the middle to end of the month here. What's interesting about this pattern too is that if we actually draw a Fibonacci retracement from the low here up to the high, where we're seeing the apex come in is actually almost a perfect touch of this 78.6 support line here, or retracement line. And so again, price level for that's going to be 1734. And so if we do zoom out here and look left, a little bit of a resistance point on this flag pattern, and then also looking farther left, pretty big point of a V-shaped bounce here. So we know that's significant as well. And just like we talked about on the weekly, if we pull up the volume, just not really that much volume at all, especially with a Visa announcement. But we also know that we're not seeing necessarily that much huge amount of bearish selling pressure. So to think that we could still maintain prices inside this pattern to ultimately kick off the 78.6 coming in at 17.34 is still a very realistic and potentially likely setup to actually experience before getting a little bit more bounce and upside as well. Now, that's definitely not to say we can't actually see a little bit more consolidation and a rally from here if we have already, in fact, bottom on this move. So several things to be mindful of in that type of scenario is that right now we are still finding resistance on these exponential moving averages, which have flipped bearish, in fact, especially now finding a little bit of daily closing resistance on top of prior daily closing support. So overall, it's still a very good sign that we have maintained daily closing support on 1928 with a low of a price level support just above the $19 level at 1902 here. So hopefully at a worst case, even if we do start to consolidate a little bit further, we would be able to maintain these very nice levels as support before ultimately seeing another run up or actually pulling back to test some of the lows on that 78.6 retracement and then kicking off later in the month and starting another bull cycle in that instance as well. My speculation, though, is that since we actually didn't really see that much upside from such a strong Visa announcement with continuation and follow through, that probably realistically and likely we're going to start to see resistance holding up and another test of this lower support coming in right at the $19 level. And especially since follow through volume hasn't necessarily been that great, we are still overall looking at a hole where we do have bigger amounts of bearish volume coming in on this daily compared to what we typically see on any type of bullish upside. So normally I would expect with a little bit of announcement like that, but like we always talk about on the channel, that one bullish news announcement is not necessarily enough to change a trend in a longer term bearish market. But like we said, analyzing the weekly chart, it does appear like some of the longer term lows are already going to be set. And so even though there could still be a potential for more price retrace over the next coming weeks, I think overall, especially after the June low and seeing this very nice rally with huge amounts of increasing volume, that anything of a pullback so far is just going to find a higher low of support compared to what we found, which we actually said was a low at 1321. And so plenty of room down to that opportunity. So even an example, if we look at right now, where we're looking at a price level just below the $20 psychological, down to that 1321 would still be about 33% downside. So the point we're getting at here is plenty of opportunity to pull back and set a higher low, which still does maintain a higher low for the longer term, as well as continuing and maintaining that longer term bullish uptrend. But yeah, so overall, zooming out, I think we can see how we're pretty much in a pretty big period of accumulation right now ever since November of last year. So for about the last year, we've just been in this big, nice, long period of accumulation, which is always what we see in these type of markets before the next leg and bull cycle does start. Obviously, no predictions on when that would be. But like I did post here over on X or Twitter, whatever you still want to call it, I still personally like Twitter, that the end of the bear market will come like a thief in the night, which essentially just means that it's not necessarily going to be anything that's immediately apparent. And it is going to be one of those things where we kind of see the end and it's all of a sudden a realization of, oh, I guess the bear market's over and now we're in a bull market. But yeah, anyway, so if you are not following me over on Twitter, at coin_trades is the handle. Go drop me a follow, and looking forward to chatting everyone over on Twitter or X. So yeah, the point we kind of look at now is that, especially after such a big pullback, very nice long opportunity to provide a lot of long-term accumulation, which allows people to establish a floor, build that confidence, and then once we start to see some upside, that's when we do start to take off again, because then in that instance, it is visual that we are then underway in a little bit more price upside. So the fact that right now we're seeing a longer-term stabilization is actually a good sign for ending the bear market, and the fact that we're already a year in should provide a little bit of hope and an optimistic viewpoint and outlook that in most cases the worst is going to be already over. But anyway, yeah, I would love to know everyone's thoughts and predictions about what would come next for Solana. And so make sure you do drop me a note down in the comments sections below, because I do love getting back to each and every one of you. That is going to go ahead and wrap up the show for now, though. So make sure you do hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe if you haven't done so and you did enjoy this type of content. That is going to wrap it up now, so do appreciate all the continued love and support. Stay safe, take care, everyone, and I'll catch you back in the next video.